I don't think about it all the time anymore. But I notice it in small ways. Like how quiet everything feels now. Not peaceful quiet. Just empty. The kind of quiet that makes you realize something used to be there all the time, and now it's gone, and you didn't even know it was something you'd miss until it disappeared. There used to be noise. Not loud, not chaotic. Just constant. Her voice moving through the room, her presence filling space without trying. Even when we weren't talking, there was this sense that something was happening. Like the air itself had weight to it. Now it's just still. I didn't expect that part to be the hardest. Not the betrayal. Not even the way everything ended. It was realizing that what I thought I had, wasn't what I thought it was. And whatever it actually was, it's something I don't know how to name now. I used to think I understood my place in her life. I thought I was the one she came back to when everything else faded. The constant. The person who mattered when the rest of the world stopped looking. That's what it felt like, anyway. And maybe that's why it took me so long to see what was actually happening. Because nothing ever felt obviously wrong at first. There was no moment where everything just shattered. No clear line where things went from good to broken. It was slower than that. Quieter. The kind of change that slips in without asking permission. I think about this one moment sometimes. It didn't mean anything when it happened. At least, I told myself it didn't. We were out somewhere, just a normal setting, nothing unusual. She was talking to someone. I don't even remember who. That's the part that sticks with me, actually. It wasn't about the person. It was about the way she looked at them. Not in a dramatic way. Not something you'd point to and say, that's it, that's the problem. It was subtle. Easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But I was. And for a second, something in me just paused. Like my brain tried to process something it didn't have the language for yet. She laughed at something they said. And it wasn't the laugh itself, it was how quickly it came. How easily. Like it wasn't something new. Like it was something she slipped into without thinking. And then she glanced back at me. Just briefly. But it felt like I had interrupted something. I remember brushing it off almost immediately. I told myself I was overthinking. That this is just how she was, open, social, magnetic. That's what I liked about her, right? That's what everyone liked about her. Still, something didn't sit right. It wasn't jealousy. At least, I don't think it was. It was more like displacement. Like I had been standing somewhere solid, and suddenly the ground shifted just enough for me to notice. Not enough to fall. Just enough to feel it. I didn't say anything. I didn't even bring it up later. It felt too small to matter. Too vague to explain without sounding like I was inventing a problem. So I let it go. Or I thought I did. But after that, I started noticing more things. Not consciously at first. Just little pauses. Slight changes in tone. Moments that didn't quite align with how things used to feel. Nothing you could prove. Nothing you could confront. Just, off. And the worst part is, once you notice that feeling, even once, you can't go back to not noticing it. It's like crossing a line you didn't know existed. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that was the moment everything started to change. Not because something had already happened. But because I had started to see. And once you start seeing, even a little, it doesn't stop. If you've ever had a moment like that, something small that didn't make sense but stayed with you longer than it should, then you already know how this kind of story begins. This is Cheating Stories with Ray. If you want to hear the rest of this one, and others like it, make sure you subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone who might recognize that feeling too. When I first met her, it didn't feel complicated. It felt easy. She had this way of making everything around her feel lighter. Conversations didn't stall. Silence didn't feel awkward. Even the most ordinary moments somehow felt like they had more energy to them. People noticed her. That was obvious right away. Not in an over-the-top way. It was more natural than that. She didn't have to try. She just drew people in. You could see it happening in real time. Someone would start talking to her, and within a few minutes, they were leaning in a little closer, paying a little more attention than they normally would. At the time, I didn't question it. I thought it was warmth. That's the word I kept coming back to. Warmth. Like she made people feel seen. Like she gave off something that others wanted to be around. And somehow, she chose me. That part mattered more than I realized. There's a certain kind of validation that comes with being with someone like that. When other people are drawn to them, when they have options, when they could be anywhere with anyone, and they still end up next to you. It makes you feel secure in a strange way. Like you must be doing something right. In the beginning, it felt balanced. She would move through social situations effortlessly, and I'd stay a little more grounded. I wasn't the center of attention, and I didn't need to be. I was comfortable in the background, knowing that at the end of the day, she came back to me. That was enough. Or at least, I thought it was. Looking back, I can see small things that didn't register at the time. Her mood would shift depending on the room. If people were engaged, laughing, focused on her, she seemed more alive. More present. But if the energy dropped, even slightly, something in her would change too. Not dramatically. Just enough to notice if you were paying attention. I wasn't, not really. I just thought she was social. That she thrived around people. That some environments suited her better than others. And honestly, I admired it. I remember thinking I could never do what she did so naturally. Walk into a room and immediately belong there. Make people feel like they already knew her. It made me feel lucky. There were moments, though, small ones, where something felt just slightly out of place. Like when a conversation would linger longer than it needed to. Or when someone's attention didn't fade, even when it probably should have. And she didn't pull away from it. She stayed in it. Let it stretch. At the time, I told myself that's just how people interact. That it didn't mean anything. Because nothing ever crossed a clear line. That's the thing. There was never anything obvious enough to point at. No single moment where I could say, this is wrong. Just a pattern of openness. A kind of availability that didn't feel limited to me, even though I was the one she came home to. And I held on to that. That idea that I was the constant. Because whenever it was just the two of us, everything felt normal again. Calm. Grounded. Like whatever energy she carried out there didn't exist when we were alone. She'd settle. Her attention would focus. Conversations would slow down. It made me believe that what we had was different from everything else. Like the rest of it was just surface level, and I was the only one who saw something deeper. I didn't realize at the time how important that belief was to me. Because it let me ignore the imbalance that was already starting to form. I was steady. She was everywhere. And somehow, that dynamic felt like it worked. At least in the beginning. Because as long as she kept coming back, I didn't question where she had been, or how much of her was still out there when she did. It didn't change all at once. There wasn't a moment where I suddenly realized things were off balance. It happened slowly, in ways that felt almost reasonable at the time. I started paying more attention to her moods. Not in an obsessive way. Just noticing. Trying to understand what made her feel good, what made her withdraw, what shifted her energy from one moment to the next. At first, it felt like care. Like I was learning her. If she seemed distant, I'd check in. If something felt off, I'd try to smooth it out. Not because she asked me to, but because it felt like the right thing to do. That's what you do when you care about someone. You pay attention. But over time, it became something else. I started adjusting without thinking about it. If she was quiet, I filled the space. If she seemed distracted, I tried to bring her back. If she was frustrated, I softened my tone, chose my words more carefully, avoided anything that might push her further away. I told myself I was being supportive. But the truth is, I was learning how to manage the atmosphere. Because her mood didn't just belong to her. It shaped everything around us. There were moments when she'd pull away slightly, not physically, but emotionally. Like her attention had drifted somewhere else, even if she was still right there. I'd feel it immediately. And instead of asking why, I'd try to fix it. I'd talk more. Be more present. Make sure she felt engaged, entertained, understood. Looking back, I don't remember deciding to do that. It just became automatic. And the strange part is, it worked. At least, temporarily. She'd come back. Her attention would refocus. Her energy would shift again, and things would feel normal. Even good. That became the pattern. A constant cycle of slight distance followed by reconnection. And every time it happened, I felt like I had done something right. Like I had kept things steady. I didn't realize I was also reinforcing something. Because the more I adjusted, the less she had to. She didn't need to meet me halfway. I was already moving. There were moments where I felt necessary. Not just wanted. Needed. Like I played a specific role in her life that no one else could. I was the one who understood her. The one who could stabilize things when her energy shifted. The one who stayed consistent when everything else around her seemed to change. That felt important. It gave me a sense of purpose in the relationship. But there was another side to it that I didn't fully see at the time. Because for all the moments where I felt essential, there were just as many where I felt interchangeable. Not in an obvious way. She never said anything like that. She never made direct comparisons. But the way she moved through people, the way attention seemed to flow in and out of her life so easily, it created this quiet question in the back of my mind. If everyone feels drawn to her, what actually makes me different? I didn't ask that out loud. I didn't even let myself sit with it for too long. Because every time that thought came up, she'd do something that pulled me back in. A moment of focus. A conversation that felt deeper. A kind of closeness that made everything else feel irrelevant again. It kept me anchored. Or at least, it kept me from drifting too far into doubt. But the imbalance kept growing. I was becoming more aware of her emotional shifts than my own. More focused on maintaining her sense of connection than questioning mine. And without realizing it, I had started to measure the health of the relationship by how she felt, not how I did. If she was happy, things were good. If she was distant, something needed to be fixed. Usually by me. It didn't feel like control. Not in the way people usually describe it. There were no rules. No demands. No clear boundaries being pushed. It was quieter than that. More subtle. Like gravity. Everything just kept pulling in one direction, and I kept moving with it. Because standing still didn't feel like an option. And the more I adapted, the harder it became to tell whether I was still in a relationship, or just holding one together. After a while, it stopped feeling like small things. Or maybe the small things just started connecting. It wasn't anything obvious. That's what made it hard to explain, even to myself. If someone had asked me what was wrong back then, I wouldn't have had a clear answer. I just would have said something felt off. There were moments where her tone would shift in ways I couldn't predict. Conversations that should have been simple would suddenly feel tense, like I had stepped into something without realizing it. I'd ask a normal question, and she'd hesitate. Not long. Just enough. Then she'd answer, but the energy would be different. Slightly guarded. Slightly distant. If I noticed it, and asked about it, she'd brush it off. It's nothing. Or, you're reading into it. And most of the time, I believed her. Because technically, there was nothing there. No proof. No clear contradiction. Just a feeling that something didn't match. But those moments started happening more often. Small inconsistencies. Tiny gaps in how things lined up. The kind you could easily ignore if you wanted to keep things simple. And I did. At least at first. I told myself relationships go through phases. That people have off days. That not everything needs to make sense all the time. But there was something else underneath it. A pattern I couldn't fully see yet, but I could feel. There were situations where she seemed more present with other people than she was with me. Not in a way that was obvious or inappropriate, just more engaged. More responsive. Like her attention had a different kind of energy when it wasn't directed at me. I tried not to compare. I told myself I was overthinking again. But once that thought enters your mind, even quietly, it doesn't leave easily. I started noticing how quickly she'd respond to certain people. How conversations would linger longer than they needed to. How she'd stay in those moments instead of stepping out of them. And when I'd bring something up, carefully, indirectly, she'd shift it. You're being insecure. You always do this. At first, those words made me step back. Not because they convinced me, but because they made me question whether I had the right to feel what I was feeling. So I adjusted again. I stopped asking as much. Stopped pointing things out. Tried to be easier. Less reactive. More understanding. But that didn't fix the feeling. If anything, it made it worse. Because now everything stayed inside. Every small moment, every inconsistency, every pause in her tone, it all just collected without anywhere to go. And the more it built up, the harder it became to tell what was real and what wasn't. I started second-guessing myself constantly. Was that actually strange, or am I just looking for something? Did that mean anything, or am I just connecting things that aren't connected? It became exhausting. Not because of what she was doing, but because of what I couldn't prove. And then I thought back to that moment. The one I brushed off. The look. The pause. That brief feeling that I had stepped into something that didn't include me. At the time, it felt insignificant. Now, it felt like the beginning of something I hadn't understood yet. Not evidence. Just a signal. And the hardest part is, once you start recognizing patterns instead of moments, you can't unsee them. Even if you want to. If you've ever been in a situation where nothing was clearly wrong, but something still didn't feel right, you know how confusing that space can be. Before we go further, take a second to subscribe, like the video, and drop a comment if you've ever ignored that feeling longer than you should have. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single moment where everything just came crashing down. It was more like something slowly came into focus, until I couldn't pretend I wasn't seeing it anymore. At first, it was still just patterns. Little things lining up in ways they hadn't before. Conversations that didn't make sense unless you looked at them from a different angle. Reactions that felt rehearsed instead of natural. And then one day, I stopped trying to explain it away. I remember sitting there, going over everything in my head, not looking for proof, just trying to make it all fit. And it didn't. No matter how I rearranged it, no matter how much I gave the benefit of the doubt, it always led back to the same place. Something was happening that I wasn't supposed to see. And the strangest part? It didn't feel hidden. That's what finally broke it for me. It wasn't careful. It wasn't subtle in the way you'd expect. If anything, it felt casual. Like whatever boundary existed wasn't something she was worried about crossing. That realization hit harder than anything else. Because it meant this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't something that slipped out of control or happened once and got buried. It felt like part of how she moved through things. I didn't confront her right away. I sat with it first. Tried to see if there was any version of this where I was wrong. Where I had misread everything. Where I could go back to how things felt before. But I couldn't. Because once it clicks, once everything lines up, you don't get to go back to not knowing. So eventually, I said something. Not aggressively. Not even accusing. Just, direct enough that it couldn't be brushed off as nothing. And the response came immediately. Not hesitation. Not confusion. Just, redirection. You're overthinking this. That was the first thing. No pause. No processing. Just dismissal. I tried again. Slower this time. More careful. I'm not saying anything specific. I just feel like something's not right. And that's when it shifted. You're suffocating me. It came out sharper than I expected. Not defensive in a quiet way, defensive like I had crossed a line. I remember sitting there, trying to understand how we got from me asking a question, to me being the problem. I'm just trying to understand, I said. You always do this, she replied. You make things into something they're not. And then it escalated. Not louder. Just, more pointed. You don't like that people are drawn to me. That's what this is. You get uncomfortable when I'm not focused on you. Each sentence landed like it had already been decided before I even spoke. There was no space for what I was actually feeling. Only space for what she said I was feeling. I tried to stay calm. Tried to explain that it wasn't about other people. That it was about something changing between us. But every time I said something, it got redirected. You're jealous. You're insecure. This is why I don't tell you things. And somewhere in the middle of that, I realized something that I hadn't fully accepted until then. There wasn't going to be an apology. Not because she didn't understand what I was saying. But because, in her version of things, there was nothing to apologize for. That was the moment it shifted for me. Not when I understood what she had done. But when I understood how she saw it. It wasn't betrayal to her. It was reaction. Something caused by me. Something justified by how I made her feel. And once that clicked, everything else started to make sense in a way I didn't want it to. The distance. The attention. The way she moved between people like it didn't cost anything. It wasn't about connection. It was about something else entirely. I remember asking one last question. Not even expecting a real answer. Did it mean anything? She didn't hesitate. It's not about that. That was it. Not denial. Not regret. Just, dismissal of the idea that it should matter in the way I thought it did. And somehow, that answered everything. Because in that moment, it became clear that I had been looking at the situation completely differently than she had. To me, this was something that broke the relationship. To her, it wasn't even operating on the same level. The person involved, the one I had been trying not to think about, suddenly felt irrelevant. Not because it didn't happen. But because it could have been anyone. There was nothing specific about it. No deeper connection. No emotional weight. Just, presence. Attention. A reflection. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't losing her to someone else. I was never competing with a person. I was competing with a need. Something that didn't have a limit. Something that didn't settle. And for the first time, I saw where I actually stood in all of it. I wasn't the center. I wasn't the priority. I was part of the structure. The one who stayed consistent while everything else moved around her. The one who absorbed the impact when things shifted. The one who made sure nothing collapsed. And the more I thought about it, the more it became impossible to ignore. This hadn't been hidden from me. Not really. It had been happening in plain sight. Just, normalized. Framed in a way that made me question myself instead of questioning it. And once I saw it that way, there was no fixing it. Because it wasn't a single action that broke things. It was the realization that we weren't even playing by the same rules. I thought I was in a relationship. She thought she was navigating something else entirely. And by the time I understood that, whatever we had left was already gone. After that conversation, things didn't explode. They just unraveled. Quietly. There was no clear ending. No moment where we both agreed it was over. We just kept moving around each other like something had already broken, but neither of us was saying it out loud. At least, I wasn't. She didn't seem affected in the way I expected. That was probably the hardest part to process. I kept waiting for something to shift in her, some kind of acknowledgement, some sign that what had happened mattered in the same way it did to me. But it never came. If anything, she seemed unchanged. Still moving through everything the same way. Still engaging, still present, still pulling attention wherever she went. Like nothing about the situation had altered how she saw herself, or us. Meanwhile, everything in me felt off. I couldn't settle anymore. Even when we were sitting in the same space, it didn't feel like we were connected. There was this constant distance, like something invisible had been placed between us, and I didn't know how to reach across it. I started replaying everything. Not just what had happened recently, but everything from the beginning. Looking for signs. Moments I had overlooked. Things I had explained away because I didn't want to question them. And the more I looked, the more it felt like I had been adjusting for a long time. I just hadn't realized how much. Conversations became harder. Not because we were arguing, but because nothing felt real anymore. Every exchange had this layer underneath it, something unspoken that never got addressed. I'd say something simple, and part of me would wonder if it even mattered. She'd respond, and I'd try to read into what wasn't being said instead of what was. It was exhausting. And still, whenever I tried to bring anything up, it would shift. I thought we moved past this. You're still stuck on that? Or worse. You're the one making this into something bigger than it is. That one stayed with me. Because it made me hesitate every time I felt something. Like maybe I was dragging it out. Maybe I was the reason things couldn't go back to normal. So I started pulling back instead. Not dramatically. Just, less. Less engagement. Less effort to fix things. Less trying to bring us back to how it used to feel. And I noticed something almost immediately. Nothing changed. There was no attempt to close the gap. No recognition that I had stepped back. No effort to meet me where I was. It just continued. That's when it really started to sink in. Everything I had been doing, the adjustments, the emotional effort, the constant awareness of her, had been holding something in place. And without it, there was nothing underneath. No balance. No mutual effort. Just movement in one direction that I had been following for so long, I didn't realize I was the only one walking. I started feeling tired in a way I couldn't explain. Not physically. It was deeper than that. Like I had been carrying something for a long time, and I had finally put it down, only to realize it had never been mine to carry in the first place. There was also this strange kind of isolation. From the outside, nothing looked dramatically different. There wasn't a clear story I could tell someone. No obvious moment I could point to and say, this is where everything went wrong. Because technically, everything was still functioning. We were still around each other. Still talking. still moving through the same routines. But internally, it was already over. And that was hard to explain. Because when something ends quietly like that, without a clear break, it leaves you in this in-between space. Not fully in it. Not fully out of it. Just stuck. I think that's when I started detaching. Not as a decision. Just as a response. I stopped expecting things to feel the way they used to. Stopped waiting for her to meet me halfway. Stopped trying to make sense of something that didn't operate on the same logic I had been using. And once that shift happened, even slightly, there was no way to go back. Because it wasn't about what she had done anymore. It was about what wasn't there at all. And once you see that clearly, staying starts to feel less like loyalty, and more like ignoring something you already understand. It didn't become clear right away. Even after I started pulling back, even after I stopped trying to hold everything together, there was still this part of me that questioned it. Not her. Myself. I kept thinking maybe I had misunderstood something. Maybe I had been too rigid. Maybe I had expected things to look a certain way, and when they didn't, I labeled it as something else. That doubt stayed longer than I expected. Because when you spend that much time adjusting to someone else's version of reality, it doesn't just disappear the moment you step away from it. It lingers. It makes you replay things in ways that don't always make sense. But distance does something. Not immediately. Not all at once. But slowly, it gives you space to look at things without reacting to them. And when I started doing that, really looking, without trying to fix anything, that's when things began to line up. Not emotionally. Logically. I started seeing the pattern. Not just the big moments. Not just what happened at the end. Everything. The way attention seemed to energize her more than connection ever did. The way people moved in and out of her life without changing how she moved through it. The way I had felt both important and replaceable at the same time, and how that didn't contradict anything in her world. It actually fit perfectly. That's what I hadn't understood before. I thought those things didn't make sense together. But they did. Because I wasn't being valued in the way I thought I was. I was being used in a way that felt like value. There's a difference. And once I saw that, it changed how I looked at everything. Moments I used to hold on to, conversations that felt meaningful, times where I thought we had something deeper, they started to feel different. Not fake. But functional. Like they served a purpose in the moment, and once that purpose was fulfilled, they didn't need to exist anymore. That was hard to accept. Because it meant I had been attaching meaning to things that weren't meant to hold that kind of weight. And it also meant that the feeling I couldn't explain back then, the one that kept coming up in small moments, that wasn't insecurity. It was recognition. I just didn't trust it. I needed something clearer. Something I could prove. But that kind of clarity doesn't always come in obvious ways. Sometimes it's just a consistent feeling that something doesn't align, and the longer you ignore it, the more it builds. Until eventually, you can't ignore it anymore. And looking back, that's what this was. Not a sudden realization. A delayed one. The truth was there the entire time. It just didn't arrive in a way I was ready to accept. If any part of this feels familiar, if you've ever had a moment where something didn't add up but you convinced yourself it was nothing, take a second here. Subscribe, like the video, and drop a comment about when you first started noticing something you couldn't explain. Because sometimes, that moment comes a lot earlier than we're willing to admit. I don't feel angry anymore. That's what surprises people when I try to explain it. They expect anger. Or resentment. Or at least some kind of lingering bitterness. And for a while, that was there. I went through that phase. Questioning everything. Replaying conversations. Thinking about what I should have said differently, what I should have noticed sooner. But that doesn't last forever. At some point, it turns into something else. Clarity, I guess. Not the kind that gives you closure in a clean way. Just a quieter understanding of what actually happened. Because the more distance I had, the less it felt like I lost something real. And that sounds harsh, even to me. But what I mean is, what I thought I had wasn't something that could exist the way I believed it did. I wasn't part of something stable that got broken. I was part of something that was always shifting. And I just didn't realize it. For a long time, I framed it as betrayal. That word made sense at first. It gave structure to what I was feeling. It explained the confusion, the hurt, the way everything collapsed. But over time, even that word started to feel incomplete. Because betrayal implies there was a shared understanding that got violated. And looking back, I'm not sure there ever was. We were operating under completely different ideas of what the relationship even was. To me, it was something you build, protect, and invest in. To her, it felt more like something you move through. Something that exists as long as it serves a purpose. And once I understood that, everything started to settle into place. Not in a way that made it easier. But in a way that made it make sense. I stopped thinking about the other person entirely. That part faded faster than I expected. Because it was never really about them. It could have been anyone. That's the part that changes how you see it. When you realize you weren't replaced, you were just one of many points in something that was always expanding. You stop asking, why them? And you start asking something else. Something harder. What role was I actually playing? And the answer to that isn't comfortable. I wasn't the center. I wasn't the one being chosen over everything else. I was consistent. Available. Steady. I made things feel grounded when everything else moved. I absorbed the instability so she didn't have to feel it. And for a while, that looked like love. At least from my side. But now I see it differently. It wasn't that I wasn't valued. It's that I was valued for what I provided, not for who I was. There's a difference there too. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. I don't blame her in the way I used to. That might sound strange. But it's not because what happened was okay. It's because I understand now that she wasn't breaking something in her mind. She was maintaining something. A system that kept her feeling validated, seen, wanted, whatever it was she needed to feel in control of herself. And I was part of that system. I just didn't know it. I thought I was building something with her. She was managing something through me. And once that difference becomes clear, there's nothing left to argue about. No explanation that changes it. No version of events where it turns into something it wasn't. Just acceptance. Not of what happened. But of what it actually was. And I think that's the part people struggle with the most. Because it forces you to ask a question that doesn't have an easy answer. If someone only holds on to you because of how you make them feel about themselves, then what were you to them? And more importantly, if you stayed because of how it felt when things were good, what were you holding on to? That's where I ended up. Not with closure. Not with a clean ending. Just with that question. And the understanding that sometimes, the hardest part isn't losing someone. It's realizing you never had them in the way you thought you did. If this story stayed with you, if any part of it made you stop and think about something you've experienced, make sure you subscribe to Cheating Stories with Ray. Like the video if it resonated, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Because sometimes, the things we don't question right away, are the ones that change everything later.